So welcome everybody. It's fantastic to be able to do this. Our experience in the past of hosting events in Peshawar has been exceptionally good. We've done several IGC, CDPR events in Peshawar. And the last event that we did, which was a webinar on sales tax, was also extremely well attended. So it seems that there's a lot of interest in these key policy topics in the province, and we are delighted to be able to facilitate these discussions. I'm Ijaz Nabi. I head the IGC program. I'm also currently heading the CDPR board. We have a fantastic panel, but I will let Ali introduce the panel and give you all the details. I just want to emphasize the huge importance of this topic. First of all, in the context of the 18th Amendment. As you will have seen, there's a lot of talk now in the papers about revisiting the 18th Amendment. I think that'll be a huge mistake. 18th Amendment is important. It's there to stay. There are aspects of 18th Amendment that need fixing. And the most important of that is strengthening the provincial revenue base. And within that, property tax is absolutely pivotal, because property sector as a whole has grown enormously in the last 3 to 4 decades. And the growth of this sector creates a huge demand on public goods, which the governments have to deliver. And so property tax is much more in the nature of a service charge than a tax. And I think people need to understand that. And once you understand that, then devolution of the public goods to the provinces has to be accompanied with an expansion of the tax base to provide those public goods. Therefore, property tax is absolutely pivotal. In the richer countries, property tax accounts for 2 to 3% of the GDP, which is a substantial share of the overall tax revenue. In developing countries, it's less than 0.5 percentage points of the GDP, and in Pakistan, it's half of that. So there's a lot of potential for this to be increased. We know from our work in Punjab that the tax base can be substantially larger than it is. The legal framework in the original design of the property tax allows for a much larger base, but then over time, we have eroded the base. It's like, constructing a bucket to collect water and then poking holes in the bucket. And all of these exemptions have resulted in a lot of potential revenue escaping the bucket. And so on the policy side, there's a lot of reform that needs to happen to plug those holes. But more importantly, and I think today's discussion will focus on that, is the role of strengthening tax administration. And we have on the panel some of the best world experts who have fortunately worked on Punjab in the recent past, and therefore have very good insights on how the tax administration side can be strengthened. So I won't say any more on the subject, because you have a great panel and we'll have a great discussion. I just want to take a few seconds to introduce Hassan. Hassan is the co-host, SEEDS, which is a program of sustainable energy and economic development funded by DFID, Pakistan. Hassan is the team leader of that program, and Hassan has had the wisdom to collaborate with IGC and CDPR for this event, which is fantastic. A former civil servant, an eminent public policy expert in Pakistan with a lot of international experience. Finally, Ali Chima. I call him the wise young man of the profession in Pakistan. I learn a lot by talking to Ali every time we converse about things. Ali is associate professor at LUMS. He is the co-founder of the Center of Economic Research in Pakistan. He is also a prime mover at Ideas, a research center, and very recently he's become director of the Mehboob al Haq Center. at Qaeda Azmi. So a man of many hats and a man of a lot of wisdom. He will be hosting the discussion today, and he will introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic event.
So I think Hassan has to say a few words, and then I'll introduce the panel, and then we can go. Hassan?
Thank you, Dr. Saab, and thank you, Dr. Chima. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, to co-host this webinar. Thank you so much to the eminent panelists and also the CDPR for arranging that. SEED is a DFID-funded program working exclusively on KP, and Adam Smith is implementing the first component. And the focus of the component is to improve economic and urban planning in KP. And it's a fairly large component. It's a 6 years program. So and still the inception phase is going on. So when we started our work with KP a few months ago, we have had various discussions with the policymakers, with civil servants in KP. And one thing was clear, that we kind of initiated our work in the midst of Corona COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what the provincial governments are feeling, and especially KP, is that federal transfers are kind of shrinking, and the importance of own source revenue and even private investment is felt at all levels. So the own source revenue discussion has become of paramount importance. But more than the revenue mobilization discussion, I do think there are other elements which are of utmost interest to a program like SEED, especially when we talk to urban planning. For instance, how can urban services be improved? And if, for instance, urban services are linked with a local revenue, can it lead to more willingness in taxpayers to pay their taxes? So I think that has a great potential when we talk about a local tax like UIPT, property tax. So I think that's one. I also think that the scale is fairly small. I think Dr. Saab has already kind of referred to that. But if you look at KP, the total UIPT collection is less than 2 billion, which is nothing, because we do know that KP has properties worth billions of rupees. And I think it's true for the whole of the country. So I think the scale is minuscule. I think secondly, when we look at the large urban centers in KP and also elsewhere in Pakistan, they have been expanding rapidly. We do know how our cities expand, how people kind of move on to the fringes, and then the city kind of keep on expanding. You travel on highways and pretty much old GT road, it's pretty much like urban sprawl all along. And one direct consequence of that is that urban services kind of get diluted. People suffer from poor services. Urban property tax is incidentally one of the biggest tax levers that the government has to influence urban policy to kind of promote vertical growth. And I have this question. I don't think whether we'll get the answer today or not, but I think the question is, how can we use property tax effectively to influence urban policy? And the third and the last point is that we look at urban property tax in this country more in terms of the properties, the annual rental values and whatnot. But UIPT is also a very important tool of land value capture. When we think of land value capture, it's a larger discussion, but I do think that property tax is a key part of that discussion. And as the governments would need to find more money for development and to invest, I do think that these land value capture discussions would become more important. So with that, I don't want to take more time from our panelists. So Dr. Chima, over to you. Thank you so much.
Ali, before you do that, let me address something. I've been remiss. We are extremely grateful to Ghazan Jamal, the advisor to the Chief Minister on property tax reform, local taxes generally. Ghazan has shown this event would not have happened without Ghazan's strong support and strong interest. And I think it's fantastic that the government of KP has appointed people of the caliber of Ghazan who understands the policy analysis well, the importance of evidence-based policy making. So we're delighted to be able to respond to Ghazan's request to conduct a series of discussions on local taxation. Ali, you are mute. You're muted.
Thanks, Ijaz. So this is a discussion that's happening particularly to start a dialogue on how do we reform property taxes in the wider context of urban development, in the massive growth of urbanization that we are seeing in Pakistan and in KP. Cities, if you look at the 2017 census, particularly larger cities, have very high rates of growth in Pakistan. And that is leading to huge amounts of congestion in migration, land values going up. And what we have is emerging service delivery deficits. Ijaz has already mentioned the shortfall on the deficit on the revenue side, but the deficits on the service delivery side are equally stark. So if you look at, for example, the percentage of households with unimproved sanitation in urban KP, the last PSLM tells us that 1 in 5 households don't have any improved sources of sanitation. And only about 1 in 5 have access to more than 6 hours of drinking water a day. So these are pretty stark deficits, which basically create service delivery inequalities across income groups, particularly hitting the marginalized really badly. So how does kind of fiscal policy fit in within this wider ambit of urban growth and growing demand in public services? That's the overall context, but we're going to focus on one instrument of fiscal policy, which is property taxation. And there are a number of challenges related to property taxation that we know from both other parts of Pakistan. There's been quite a lot of experimentation in Punjab over the past decade. There's learning from there and from other contexts. And we're very lucky to have a set of experts with us who are not only people who worked on basically fiscal policy issues, but have focused on these questions. And basically, particularly 2 of them who I'm going to introduce first, have done a lot of work on property taxation in Pakistan. So with us is Dr. Asim Ijaz Khaja, who is the Director of Center of International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a professor of economics over there. And Asim, over the past decade, has been involved in creating evidence and in looking at design and impacts of different interventions that have been tried in Punjab. And it's a diverse set of interventions. So we were really lucky to have him with us to tell us what are the challenges and what are the potentials of this experimentation. With us also is Dr. Mujtaba Paracha, who's officer of the Pakistan Administrative Service, currently Pakistan's ambassador to WTO. But it's not in that hat that he's sitting on this table. Mujtaba has been a researcher of issues of property taxation. This was part of his PhD thesis, which is currently being converted into a book by Oxford University Press. And in addition to that, Mujtaba's last posting before he went as ambassador was as Commissioner Lahore. So he's very familiar with basically local institutional challenges because, I want to point this out, that property taxes are a local tax. They're not a provincial tax, but they're actually a local tax. And there are a set of challenges around the institutional context, but obviously Mujtaba's own thesis was also around the taxation institutional framework and the challenges there. With us also is Ms. Astrid Haas, who's the policy director of the International Growth Center, who before this, whose own research agenda is around cities, and she's done a lot of work around property tax policy in the context of Africa, but globally. We also have with us, as Ijaz has pointed out, Mr. Ghazan Jamal, who's the Special Assistant to the Chief Minister on Excise and Taxation in KP. He is a major part of a reform effort which is looking into modernizing and reforming the institutional foundations and apparatus on which property taxes are built in KP. And then we have Richard O, who's the senior economist and team leader of macro stability and growth in DFID Pakistan. So I just want to, the way we're going to structure it is that this is a moderated discussion. So it's going to be free flowing, but around some structured issues that I'm going to start by framing, but I'm going to keep picking as the discussion goes on. That conversation will go on for about an hour, and then we'll open it up to the audience for about 30 minutes. So audience is recommended that they should type in their messages and send their questions through chat, which our team will be putting through to me, and I'll start to pose them after an hour. So let me start with the first question that I have, which kind of builds on what Ghazan said about the importance of own source revenue. There's been very little sort of effort or work on improving own source revenue in Pakistan. And whenever, sort of the question of own source revenue actually comes up, basically there's a lot of pushback from taxpayers around the fact that basically in their minds, the tax burden is pretty high in the form of not only a high rate of GST and income taxes, but also implicit taxes that are there. That's the general argument that one hears. And the idea is that, there's another set of taxation that is going to be introduced, and it's almost seen as being done at the behest of donors. So is this a fair kind of concern, or is the instrument of own source revenue taxation, particularly property taxation, an instrument that allows us to address bigger development challenges that affect citizens are important for them? So I want to start by sort of some framing around how we should think about this tax and how should it be designed and what kind of objectives should it be made to fulfill. So let me kind of start by turning to Astrid, and then I'll bring in Asim and then open it up.
Thanks, Ali. And thanks for having me here today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I think, interestingly, sort of starting from is this sort of a donor push? I think actually what we see in many of the places that I work, which is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, is that it's an increasing push by cities in particular, and local governments to actually now realize this own source revenue. And the increasing realization that, particularly now as we face a global economic crisis, external funds are drying up, other funds are drying up, and this is actually a particularly powerful tool that cities have. And I think why it's so powerful is in two respects in my mind. So one is that unlike sort of an income tax or personal income tax, properties are visible and relatively easy to value depending on what your valuation methods are, but you can see what their characteristics are. And in particular, if you want to tax them, they're not going to get up and move like people are. And so I think that's the first bit. But secondly, I think it's a fair tax to pay. And in the sort of opening statements, there was this realization that cities are growing really rapidly, and that is going to require services and infrastructure for the government to invest, but that requires money. And that money has to come from somewhere. Someone has to pay for that. And I think the other part is that the investments that are made by government increase the value of these properties even more. And that is actually a public investment rather than any private investment. And so how you tax the properties is really just being able to take the publicly created value and being able to reinvest that again. And so I think we need to think about it both from the administrative perspective of a local government, that I think it's a very powerful tool, but also from a fairness perspective, the fact that local governments have to make these investments and then recapturing these values from these investments and reinvesting them is very important. You're on mute, Ali.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Asim, I just want to turn to you that if, this reform discussion, what kind of objectives around property taxation should a reform discussion be looking into? I think part of the reaction from the taxpayer is that the whole conversation is in terms of just increasing revenues. And it's not tied to other objectives that matter for taxpayers. So I think just for framing, it would be good to think how we should think about objectives when thinking about property taxation.
Thanks, Ali. I mean, I agree with kind of what Astrid said, but I think if you step back a bit and say, look, what is the purpose of the state? Let's just ask perhaps a simple question like that. And the fundamental reason for existence of the state is that the state provides citizens services. That's why we create states. And so to me, the reason I kind of mention a question as big as that is that I feel like, obviously, once you start with that premise, then the question is, well, then how does the state afford these services? Well, citizens have to come together to pay for these services. Hence, the idea of linking taxes with services becomes inherent. So how does a state raise resources? Primarily taxes, or obviously utilizing state assets. I think this is something where of all the taxes one can think of, the one tax which has the clearest link between this citizen-state compact, if you will, is property tax, actually. And it has been effectively used. What is striking in countries like Pakistan and developing countries in general is not just that the property tax is so small. All our taxes are small relative to developed country taxes and tax collection. But it's actually even in that benchmark. So if you look at, let's say what contributions income tax or sales tax makes vis-a-vis property tax between developed and developing countries, you'll actually see that property tax underperforms even in a metric like that. So there's a really nice piece of work that I'd encourage kind of people to look at. This is a paper by Anne Brockmeyer and co-authors looking at kind of just generally like what is the optimal property tax in countries. Their work is in Latin America, but the striking figure they start their paper with is the ratio of, say, income tax between rich and poor countries is like more or less 1-to-1. We kind of, or sales tax, sorry. But property tax is like 1/10 or 1/8 of what we should be collecting relative to, say, a rich country. And so clearly this is a seriously underutilized tax. And when you add to this that this is the one tax which really has a hope for very clearly establishing the link between payments and services, I think it could be an incredibly powerful tax, not just for raising revenue for its own sake, but reestablishing trusts that the citizen may have in the state, which then has all these positive externalities on other kinds of taxes. So I'll stop for a second there and come back in a longer discussion on, well, how, if that is the link, how do we establish that? What can we do to establish that?
So, Mujtaba, let me turn to you. Asim and Astrid are both quite optimistic about this being an extremely important tax in terms of creating this link with service delivery and as an instrument to build a trust in the state and then having a spillover effect with citizens contributing to the state so that the state can afford to then pay for these services. Are you as optimistic about the property tax as a tool of policy? I don't want to get into the discussion right now about how it's being implemented and what the failures are there, because I want to spend a lot of time on that. But as a kind of bigger picture, are you optimistic about this as an important tool of policy, and if so, why?
Yes. So thank you, and it's great to be here. And property tax seems a distant memory, but it's nice to bring a lot of things together. Happy to be part of this discussion. Theoretically, what Astrid and Asim are saying is very much true. It is ideal. It is people should pay for the services that they're getting. The government has no other way. There are other ways of paying it, but we're not getting into that. But historically, this has been the optimal way for paying for services. It also, yes, it supposedly tightens the fiscal contract or the social contract between the citizens and the state. Element of reciprocity, expectations, added transparency to the government, accountability, etc. But in our context, coming very quickly down to the Punjab case and perhaps even the KP case, this, like you said very rightly, is in most parts of the world predominantly local government tax. Now, to have this equation within the ambit of this tax, or other taxes also at the local government level, have this equation built up between the citizens and the state, the superstructure that you, or maybe the substructure, if you may, that you want or need for that is a very well-working, or even a working to a certain degree, local government system. So your town hall meetings are essential for providing a pedestal for where citizens can get together and say, you know, this is the services we need, this is what we are willing to pay for it. You know, the debate. That unfortunately is missing in the case of Pakistan, has been there probably in very sort of small pieces of time, but generally has been missing. And even when so that is one point to take home from this, but the other point is that even when that existed, like in the decentralization in 2000s, which was by far probably the most empowered decentralization we had in Pakistan, at the devolution plan of 2000. This tax is collected by and most of the policy handles of this tax were with the provincial government. Now that totally shrank the space for that debate to be held at the town hall, because they had no levers over policy. So when I was out in the field talking to some of these town TMA people, the town municipal administration people, they would say that, listen, I mean, if we're going to increase the new areas of new urban developments for this tax, then those are remoter areas which don't have the same level of services that the older areas have. So it is very commonsensical that you need a lower level of tax to get into a new area, right? The town government did not have the power to have that lower level of tax, okay? So with the result that if you remember those 10 years of devolution in 2000, I think apart from one or two exceptions, that was also in Lahore in a totally different ambit, but no TMA out of, I think 100 and something, 44 TMAs in Punjab expanded the area where property tax is levied, the limits of the urban area. So I'll leave it at those 2 points there. Thank you.
So Richard, I mean, how does DFID in its country strategy view this tax, not only in Pakistan, but sort of what's the cross-country experience there?
Thank you. It's interesting, actually. I haven't come across large numbers of cases where we've been working on property tax, but I think the common point we've seen is that it can be tremendously important wherever you can draw that line of sight between the citizens, the service provision, and the tax. You can start building the trust. And for me, it's almost like when you have that starting point in low tax compliance environments, you can use that almost like a gateway. You know, like you hear about gateway drugs. Can you have like a gateway tax that once the citizens establish that trust with government, that services can be provided in exchange for their levies or their taxes, you can then build that confidence to comply with other taxes as well, and that trust between government and the citizens. So I think I have seen some good examples in other countries where you get to that very local level, and that service provision at a market level, whether it's presumptive tax or whatever else, you do build that trust and you do see those revenue gains. It's hard, it can be hard work, and I think property tax has good prospects for being a much more efficient than some of the other presumptive tax type measures. But yeah, no, I think that line of sight is crucial.
So actually, it's interesting you say that, because I've been reading a lot of British economic history of the 19th century, and you couldn't get a more unitary state than Britain. But even over there in the 19th century, the big sanitation water revolution that came in actually municipal cities led by mayors. And property taxes were actually an extremely crucial instrument, as they were indeed in the growth of US cities during that time. Not only because they provided direct revenues, but they created the income base around which cities could actually float bonds to actually attract financing for long-term development of this infrastructure. So in some sense, there's a dissonance between the instruments of the 19th century and the 20th century, when property tax, even in the UK, is really challenged, as we know, in terms of design. But let me turn to Ghazan before I kind of shift focus on the link question that Asim raised, which I think is central. But Ghazan, it seems to me that here's a tax which has the ability not only to raise revenue, in some sense I would say that's even a secondary objective, but it is an instrument that can allow governments to commit to providing services and entering into a contract with citizens to say, if you provide this taxation to us, we can visibly demonstrate to you that against it we are providing services. But I think Mujtaba raised a number of important institutional questions, which is right now in the institutional structure in Pakistan, that linkage is broken, where the taxation instruments are with the excise departments, which are provincial. In some laws, they're actually hardwired into the law. The taxation is actually set in the law. So no parliament or no council has the instrument available to them. And then you have these sporadic local governments which come and go, whose elections happen and sometimes don't happen, although you belong to a party which is committed to a local government policy reform as a manifesto commitment. Are you seeing, as a person sitting on the reform table, the issue of property taxation as a very narrow issue of what to do in terms of provincial taxes? Or is the KP government approaching it broadly in terms of developing and reforming the institutional edifice that can actually help build these linkages and make it part of a broader institutional reform that includes property taxation and local government?
So I think there are two key issues that we have in terms of both in terms of the linkages, but also the importance of this tax. Unfortunately, I think primarily because the dependence on federal transfers has been so high, that provincial taxes generally haven't really had the importance that they should have had, and own source revenue collection hasn't really had the importance within government that it should have had. As a result of that, I feel like we've kind of, property taxes true potential hasn't really been realized. And so because of that, you don't really have enough to show that service delivery to begin with. And as a result of that, what's actually happened is that linkages that you talk about, it's exactly, theoretically speaking, that's why 85% of this tax does go to local governments. The reason there is that linkage is broken is because most of that just goes into salaries. And so the service delivery portion of it that's supposed to create that confidence from the citizen side isn't really seen. And that's something that we're trying to address now. And then there are anomalies like Dr. Mujtaba mentioned, between the fact that one department or one like a local government system declares what is an urban area, another declares or decides, another set within the government decides what the tax rate is going to be then for that area. Another then decides what kind of, is it going to be a rental system or a different system and all. And so, and none of these are talking to one another, which is why then, like you mentioned, that in areas where some of these services might be needed and you can convince the citizens that if you pay, we can provide those services, the service provision authority might not have the authority to actually impose these taxes. And so then they depend on other departments for that kind of stuff. And so what we're trying to change, and in the current finance bill, we have done that, is to try and limit that as much as possible and kind of bring it together at some stage. And so we've taken a step in that direction exactly. And we're going to, one of the moves exactly is this, to try and get citizen involvement. And then there are other anomalies, like in certain areas, like for example, this tax could only go to TMAs. And so if you have a development authority, and I'll just give you an example, Hyderabad, which is one of the major townships inside Peshawar, constitutes about 30% of the total property tax in the entire province. And yet none of that money could be spent here because the law doesn't allow the money to be transferred to a development authority, and it doesn't fall under a TMA. So we've kind of tried to change those anomalies so that at least the service provision, there is that link. Citizens can see that link between service provision and the tax being collected.
So that's actually interesting. So one way to think about the current institutional structure is that it's extremely fragmented. And I think what you're trying to, the way you're approaching this is to consolidate city governance in some sense, and making the agency that is responsible for delivery also the agency that benefits from the tax, which seems to be in line with the points that Asim, Astrid, and Mustafa were making. Asim, I want to come to you because you worked with the Punjab government basically on interventions that were directly trying to address this question of a broken linkage. But interestingly, you were doing this within this fragmented institutional structure, because obviously that current space when you guys started didn't allow the bigger reform to be envisaged. So what kind of interventions do you, I mean, since you would have thought about the possible interventions that you people thought would have promise, and what are the challenges that you see in terms of strengthening the linkages between service delivery and revenue?
Great, thanks, Ali. I just wanted to, before I jump onto that, so it's a great question. It's a tough one, so I'm just buying time to think through my response. I did want to echo two things. I mean, I love the language Richard used on the gateway tax. I think that's spot on. I'm going to appropriate that, Richard, with publicly, you're now giving me authority. I have copyright transfer now. I also wanted to echo what Mustafa and Razan said, which I think is really critical. I think Astrid pointed nicely to the fact that from an enforcement perspective, because this is observable, it makes things in a capacity sense easier. Although that also makes the politics of it harder, actually, precisely because it's easier. So there'll be an interesting part. I mean, I find it shocking that it takes so long in countries to update tax tables, and the fact that tax tables tend to be nominal and not even real. That's just, even inflation indexing taxes at a time when we had a property boom would have given us massive increases in taxes. But also I wanted to echo what Mustafa and Razan said, which is, you know, until you make the local government, both the coordination part and the local government really own this tax, and I don't mean provincial, I really mean local in the way Mustafa suggested, I just don't think we can make huge progress. And I'm going to come back, Razan, to put you on the spot question, which is the KP government willing to do that? Is the KP government willing to say that each local municipality can have the ability to not only manage this tax, but actually decide things like tax rates? I mean, would you be willing to go that far? I don't want to immediately pose that question now, but that to me would be critical, because that's what's going to create this competition. I'm seeing one of the questions in the session saying, look, people are willing to pay taxes. I think, you know, when people like Bhutto said Makan, I never took that to mean literally the house. I took that to mean amenities, which are related to living. And when you think of that, our citizens, I mean, have demonstrated massively that they're willing to pay a lot for that. I mean, your success of the Bahariya schemes and defense is a very stark manifestation for that, except sadly that money has not gone. It's gone to people in Vardis and it's gone to private contractors, not to the state. So there's a willingness to pay for this as well. So to Ali, to your point, how does one establish the link? I think you have to start with the premise of not skepticism. It's not that, oh God, people will never do this, we're poor. I think people have demonstrated they will pay. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, right? This is analogous to the educational debate where are people willing to pay for quality education? Absolutely. The rise of the private sector has demonstrated that. I think the rise of housing societies in our urban areas across Pakistan has demonstrated people will pay, and pay a lot, for good amenities around where they're living, right? So that's one. So I think that's a huge plus. Once we recognize that, that's actually a huge sigh of relief in some sense, right? So all we've got to do now is cater to that demand. If we had to do demand creation, we'd be in a much tougher situation. Now the question is, how do you cater to that demand? And I think this is the question, Razan, you raised, a chicken and egg question, which is, and I'm going to put Richard, you on the spot as well, because might as well, you guys can return the favor, which is, how do you jumpstart the process? If you don't have the revenue to deliver the right services, if you don't have the logistical structure, which is what we were facing in Punjab as well, exactly what you said, there isn't a single authority. So we go running around trying to interface between the excise department, between the finance department, between the local government department, between the planning and development department. And we end up playing this role, which really a local authority should have been unifying itself, right? But you need money. The citizen is not going to, unfortunately, we are in a situation in Pakistan where the citizen isn't trusted enough, regardless of which government you have. So this is not a critique on this government. It's the last 50 years of Pakistan, which includes democratic, non-democratic, your favorite party, your favorite not party, whatever you want. It includes everyone. I don't think any one of them has been able to demonstrate the first mover of saying, okay, we know you don't trust us. Here's what we're going to give you for free, effectively, in lieu of the fact that you will give us something in future. It can't be free in that sense, right? It's a promise of continuing support, but we take the first step. For that, and this is what I meant by putting Richard and others on the spot, we need funds to come in, right? Who's going to give those funds? Maybe those are donor funds. Maybe those are charitable funds from citizens who want to jumpstart this gateway process, as we put it. And so I would say that's the first move, Ali, which is a citizen, while they're willing, need to be convinced that the state can actually do something. And that's sadly where we are. And not just do something, there's so much skepticism. So we've been working now for the last 3 years, as you said, precisely doing this, right? In Punjab, we're doing an experiment where in 2 cities in Punjab, Lahore and Faisalabad, we've demarcated smaller neighborhoods. And in those neighborhoods, we've basically started delivering services according to citizens' preferences. So we go into these areas and we ask citizens, what do you want? When I say we, I mean the tax collector. And that's a really different, the guy who's going to collect taxes, before they ask you for taxes, are coming in and saying, what would you like to be delivered in your neighborhood? And then they deliver them, right? And even that experiment has taken a while to gradually build momentum because there's lots of skepticism. I don't know if we'll get it. So even if you give it, I think convincing and showing and demonstrating, sometimes you don't see the service, right? You just made a street light. You don't recognize this was paid by my money. So I think having that kind of explicit ownership is going to be critical. So that's the starting process. And again, I can add more details. Others here have a lot to add to this. But that's how I would start. So good news, there is demand. Not so good news, we have low levels of trust. So we need to start by offering stuff and then telling them and reminding them constantly what we're offering.
So Asim, just one thing I want to kind of want you to elaborate is this notion of using the neighborhood, because I know the neighborhood in that experiment were actually small neighborhoods.
Yes.
Is that important? Because, there are different layers. In the KP local government structure, you have basically tehsil governments, town governments, and then you have neighborhood councils. But neighborhood councils are areas of roughly 7,000 population, if I'm right, Ghazan. I may be wrong. I think it's roughly about that. I think your neighborhoods were much smaller. So Absolutely. Does the scale of the unit actually matter?
I think it just, it's a great question. First of all, honest answer, I don't know, right? I think we can only discover by doing. the evidence, the reason we went with households of 100 and 150 or so, which also to us was large, like anecdotally, and Mushtaba can bring in a lot of evidence over here, this is his domain, more qualitative kind of analysis on these parts as well, which is, when people talk about units of decision making in our urban areas, we often use the word gully, street, right? Like when you have a security guard that you pay for, a chowkidar, at what level do people congregate on it, right? And so the classic public good theory says, look, as long as when you make the group N large, you're going to get both heterogeneity in preferences, so people will want different things. That makes the aggregation problem harder. You'd also get difficulty in enforcing payments and behavior. Now, what that optimal is will be a function of how cohesive society is. So in a large village with one clan, it actually can be a very large unit. In an urban area where you have high mobility and strangers, it could be very small. And so to me, some of this, if I were to advocate this, I would say a government should do much more. And I'm going to say this, and Mushtaba is going to smile and say, I'm going to quote you on this, is we need a lot more qualitative work on trying to figure out what is the right social fabric in my area. And in some areas, it could be a really large unit, and others not, rather than us trying to predefine it. Because what we really need is exactly preference heterogeneity, homogeneity, and the ability to enforce. Because the willingness to pay this tax is not going to come from just an individual. It's a collective decision. It has to be that your neighbor says, "Yaar Mushtaba, tune tax nahi diya yaar, kya kar rahe? Wo pani lagwana tha. You didn't pay tax. We needed a open water or portable water over here. Because of you, we didn't get it." You need that kind of, and we have that in our societies, right? It's just a matter of activating it. So that's what I would say. And then just so that I don't look too soft on that qualitative side, eventually you might want to experiment a bit. You might want to try different structures and say, look, let's experiment out. Let's do the smallest unit neighborhood, a street, and then try a larger one, which is an administratively more recognized one, and see what happens. My instinct is the smaller unit will still be the right one. And I think that'll raise administrative challenges, absolutely.
Astrid, what's the experience from the places you've worked in on this question of strengthening this kind of linkage?
Yeah, so in my own city, we've actually had a major increase in own source revenue in the last couple of years, and that has come from an increasing recognition that we need to improve service provision. And how do we do that? I will say, just to caveat that, it's been a major increase in relative terms. In absolute terms, our own source revenue is still not sufficient in any way, and that gets to the point that I will just pick on that Asim said. So how do you kickstart this? But I will say a couple of things. So from my own city, one of the things, so in Kampala in Uganda, one of the decisions that was taken in 2011 was actually to split the revenue and the expenditure departments at a city level. And the reason being is that the understanding is it's always much easier to spend the money than it is to collect the money. And that has really strengthened a core group of people whose sole purpose it is to be able to collect revenue. And I think that was a really important innovation in that. And so on the one hand, obviously we want to link revenue to expenditures. On the other hand, we also have to recognize, again, particularly when we think about politics, it's always easier to spend. And I think that's another part where the politics of property tax is important to think about, and how you can sort of resist the pushback that you will get. The second thing is our law actually stipulates that at least 75% of what is raised from property tax has to go back into service delivery to avoid the challenge that Khazan was picking up about sort of the salaries and going into salaries. But again, if you think about it in absolute terms, it's still not enough to provide the infrastructure and services. But what did happen, when we started to strengthen our municipal finance systems at a city level, was that we did get a very large World Bank loan that has helped provide infrastructure and services. And that it has created visibility because they're particularly visible infrastructures. So they're streets, they're street lights. And this has all happened at the same time as the revenue systems were strengthened, and I think has created credibility. But I think a really good example of how you can do this linkage, perhaps even without needing to necessarily spend more, comes from Lagos in Nigeria. And when they reformed their land use charge, they did what Asim said. They went out to citizens and they said, hey, what would you like us to spend your money on? Except they had a predetermined list. So it was things that they were already spending money on. It's just that the citizen hadn't internalized that they were spending money on that. And so after they collected the property tax or the new land use charge, what they did is they put up big billboards and they said, your money was spent on this. Now, this is like, I think, a challenge, and you know, I'm really not an expert on Pakistan or in KP, but it is a challenge I see in a lot of cities, whereas the city is already making a lot of expenditures, right? They are already collecting rubbish, they are already putting up street lights, but it's that link is not actually known or communicated. So yes, part of it may be, you know, kickstarting the actual spending with a big loan or what, you know, other places where you can find the money to be able to do that. But part of it is actually just better communicating what you're actually already doing to the citizen. And I think that's just, it's very important, particularly when we think about cash-strapped environments, that can already start this sort of, again, like Asim, I shall also co-opt the gateway notion, because I think that's very nice, but it can kickstart this process with just sort of from a communications perspective.
By the way, what Astrid just said is true in our data as well. That's spot on, Astrid. We're also finding that even in places where we've delivered, and we've put stickers and stuff in the same way, a lot of citizens just, you know, life is tough. You're thinking of 1,000 things. You just don't see it. And so the idea of reminding people that this was done by your money and according to your preferences is actually really powerful and really necessary.
So Astrid, just one thing, one clarification. So when you say you had kind of specialization of revenue from the expenditure side, but they were both reporting to the same city government, right?
Yes.
They weren't reporting to different layers of government.
No. They're both within the city government, just separate directorates, essentially.
Right. So that's just kind of a specialized organization of local government where revenue is a specialized function with specialized capacities, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Mujtaba, sort of Astrid raised this important point about the kind of politics of the reform. At least on our panel, there seems to be a consensus along with you that going in the direction of building these linkages, of creating the foundations of the kind of gateway taxation, to again quote Richard, is important. But what's kind of the politics of this institutional interface? Because as you rightly pointed out, in our case, excise is reporting to basically the provincial government and to really a minister. The city government is doing its spending, but then the provincial government has these development authorities, companies, agencies, which are delivering overlapping functions. So, you know, and I as a citizen, I'm constantly unhappy with all of these guys. So if somebody, you know, gives me some water, I'm now wondering which guy is kind of taking false credit and who did the job. So there's just general, I mean, even if you put up billboards, it's really unclear basically who's doing what. But if we want to integrate, what are the political hurdles that you see, you know, given, you know, that you've been part of the system? That'd be interesting to hear that.
So I'll touch a couple of points here. I mean, totally agreed that with you on the fact I, as a civil servant, was very upset with that kind of fragmented governance, which, I mean, for me, the charge in Lahore, especially after the PhD, where you became a little more reflective on these things, it was abysmal. You had multiple agencies, like you say. I'll give you a very vivid example. We had these lighting on a lot of tube lights around that flyover near the Azadi Chowk where Minar-e-Pakistan is. And some of these lights went out. And, you know, I got a call from the chief minister, you know, we went all around, the lights are out, you know. So we went looking for whose lights they were. So it turned out that in that 1 square kilometer area with the flyovers in Minar-e-Pakistan area, the lights belong to PHA, and these are street lights, PHA, MCL, LDA, and another agency that even I forget. So 4 agencies have tube lights running in 1 square kilometer area. So that attribution, or who's doing what and who's taking your money and who else is delivering, it's a huge question when it comes to developing this linkage. I'll leave it at there. Coming back to what Asim was talking about, just a point he made was, where does it start? Where do you break the circle, or where do you break the vicious circle of no tax, no money? I mean, there are people like Richard Murphy of Action Aid who talk about tax. They start with expenditure, and they say actually tax is the money that the government has already spent. It's just taking, so it's not people's money that the government is taking. It is actually the government's money which has been spent that it is getting back from the people, because in the next cycle it needs to spend it again. So if you start looking at things, and he's a very rabid kind of a tax person, which is brilliant. So he sort of turns the whole argument on its head, and he says, so the point to take from that would be that the government, these are great days to print money. Every government, because of this COVID, everybody is spending money. So it makes our problem easy. You go ahead, spend money, and then show to the people what the government can do. And this is a very hands-on kind of thing that I'm putting out here, and then show what you can do, what you can deliver, and then go and ask for tax. I mean, the voluntary compliance, so to say, is expected to arise when that happens. Coming to your question very directly, we have had a local government dispensation which has only existed when the federal or federal level really wanted it during military governments. During dispensations of more democratically elected governments, it has kind of disappeared or been in a very weak kind of. I've been administrator of the municipality in Lahore also. The opposition of provincial and national elected politicians to local government politicians is immense. For multiple reasons that I won't go into, but that is why MPs and MNAs want to go and build streets, and they want to sort of, so there's a whole sort of local political politics around it, mostly of patronage and getting votes and all that. So here is what I put on the table. The provincial government, and this is what I found in my research, did not only actively, not only sort of ignored property tax or let it be, but it actively made efforts and actively did things like giving exemptions, huge exemptions that would ensure that local governments were denied additional resources. In the literature somewhere I read, it's given a very interesting term called tragic brilliance, where you deny lower level of government resources. And I've seen, in my work, I find that there were instances when there were no local governments that they really did, like Punjab government did try to go from rental to capital value when there were no local governments. So they see that revenue as setting off some of the resource constraints that they might have to spend at the local level. They see it as their money. But when the local governments are functional, they don't see it as their money. I'll leave it at that.
So, of course, let me add that when Mujtaba was Commissioner Lahore, he wasn't a representative of the state. He was the state in Lahore. So you just,
I hear there are people looking for me. Don't say that.
But let me turn to Ghazan. I mean, Ghazan, I think Asim's question is really the important question for you. I mean, it's pretty clear that you need to bring all this edifice, all these instruments, service delivery, taxation under one roof within cities. There is a local government law over there. How serious is the KP government about moving in this direction? I actually have a couple of questions. I'm going to keep taking questions, I think, because they're being posted. There's one question, by Hamza Khan, who says it seems trust in property taxes directly correlated to local government success. Isn't KP far from that goal, as are other provinces in Pakistan? So that's a question I think that's resonating with the public too. I'm going to leave. There's another question. I'm going to come back to it. So what do you think about the opportunities this reform holds, and whether you'd be able to navigate that process?
Yeah, I think the honest answer at this moment is that unfortunately we're not quite there yet, right? What's happened is, and at the stage where we're at in our reform agenda, in terms of taxation, is to kind of consolidate some of our taxes. The important ones with a lot of potential, the modern ones that are charged everywhere around the world, concentrate on those, lift them to a number like Hassan initially mentioned, that we're not even collecting 2 billion at this point. The year before we collected 1.3, it's something like 800 million now. And so to make it a real proper tax that means something and can make a difference, and at the same time, at our local government levels, across the board in different other departments as well, there are so many various different taxes that they're charging. Like just last year, just to give you one example, there were over 200 various kind of fees and taxes in local government that we've abolished. And there's still a whole lot there. So I think we're at the stage where we're just trying to abolish all the ones that aren't really, on the revenue side, aren't really collecting much. It actually costs us more to collect that tax than the tax or the fees that actually collected. And kind of after that, we'll get to that debate of where, giving that authority over to the local government and all. To the honest answer is we haven't even thought about it because we're not there yet at this point, unfortunately. But I think what is important, and what Dr. Mustafa also kind of pointed towards, that even if we move towards that, to build that, you'd have the first step needs to be there. Proper elected local government systems, accountable to the public, need to be in place for us to then be able to do that. And my fear at this stage is that at this point, if we transfer that, the effect it's going to end up happening, because in our laws, something like we've said that 30% of all development funds of the province, regardless of whatever they collect themselves, will be spent through the local government. The impact that might end up happening at a stage where we're trying to make property taxes and other taxes like these a real force, or kind of to make a real difference, that amount being transferred directly to them from the province is going to be enough for them not to be willing to take that political hit of trying to collect these taxes. And the example I'll give why I think that is because right now, currently, when we don't have elected members, everyone is pushing us that now is the time to kind of add on new areas where we are giving municipal services, but they're not they don't fall under the property tax net. And they're saying that once you get elected members, they're never going to allow that to happen. Ideally, what you would want is that if it's a VC, whenever it's converted to a neighborhood council and the government is forced to give municipal services, that should automatically, property taxes should be charged on them. What percentage, whatever, we can talk about the rates. But at this point, that's not how it happens. There has to be a separate permission given. And so because of that, they've made their own system of measurement. They call it a ward. And there's no real definition of, one ward does not match in any way, shape or form to another one. And that's another area which we're trying to kind of look at to kind of standardize the way we measure these things. Apart from that, I think a really good question that Dr. Asim raised about how to kickstart it. We've kind of thought about that, and we're moving in the direction what Astrid talked about, that at least some percentage, even if it's 30-40% of the revenue at this point, we would say that it has to be spent on development. And in this year, during COVID, we're kind of trying to see the advantage of trying to get people to willingly pay, where we've actually connected all our own source revenue with being spent on COVID. Roughly last year, we collected around 40 billion. Overall, our own source revenue was about that much. That's the amount we expect to be spent on COVID for this year. And so we've kind of linked the two. And so if that raises, like there's no, like we mentioned, the citizens may not be able to see other kind of expenditure that we're doing at this point. but the expenditure we're doing on COVID is very, it's very visible at this stage. And so we're hoping that that kind of would be a good experiment for us to see if that increases willingly, like payment and all. But kind of highlighting that and advertising that to the public is something that we're definitely lacking. I would admit to that. And I think that's a really important part of the thing as well, because you can be doing it behind the scenes, but if the public doesn't know that these linkages have been made, you won't get really the effect that you want.
Okay, I mean, there are again two great questions here. Who are saying the people are saying that it's very important to also modernize property records because property rights become opaque, and you're not going to be able to kickstart this system till urban land record and property rights security actually goes up. I'm not going to get into this, but I think the idea is that you have to think about a coherence of functions which help give people certainty and then tie the tax to it. And that institutional reform agenda seems to be pretty primary in my view. But Richard, kind of the Asim question, you gave a great kind of, term. How do you kickstart it?
Thanks. Yeah, I was quite nervous when he directed that question at me first, and then I think subsequent panelists have done a great job in giving some good answers on how you kickstart it. I mean, my reflection on it is, whether you have a donor there or not to help, the downside of having a donor there is a donor will want their flag on it if there's an expenditure that's going on there, and the degree to which that helps establish that social compact and trust between the citizen and the government and the citizen is some degree limiting. But I think that you can start small, and I think you don't necessarily. I mean, the things that Mr. Jamal was saying earlier sound incredibly sensible in terms of how you go about it, how you start drawing that line. You don't, 30% of property tax revenues coming from one urban centre in KP. It's important to show, even if it's not that they're getting sort of the 30% of the expenditure, but they are getting something. They are seeing something visible for that. So I think start small if you need to, if the resources are constrained, but do try and make something tangible and visible to people around it.
Okay, I want to kind of shift tack now and come to the question of what type of property should be taxed. So this is more a policy question. As Mujtaba has already kind of sort of laid out, in South Asia and in Pakistan, in India and most states, basically what you do is you tax built structures. You don't tax land. So there's very little land taxation that actually happens. And sort of there is a debate, Hassan also talked about it, about land value capture. So what are the kind of pros and cons of carrying on with the annual rental value system as it's known of property taxation? So let me begin with Astrid, and then I'll open it up to others.
Yeah, so I think it's a super interesting question because it's the same tax system in my own country. It's rental values and it's only on buildings. And I think I would say the constraints of using rental value is that it will only give you the tax based on what the best current use is, not what the best possible use is of that building, right? And I think that's one major constraint. The other part is land is actually even more efficient to tax than buildings, because if you tax buildings, you may disincentivize people to build. And so you may incentivize them rather to hold the land vacant and speculate. And that's a big problem in my own city. And we talked at the beginning about even, Ali, you mentioned in your sort of opening remarks about how you can use property tax as a tool beyond just the revenue generation. And I think that is one challenge is when you tax just the structures, you may disincentivize sort of efficient use of the land overall. That being said, in my own context in Kampala, taxing land is extremely difficult because we use the rental value because it is the easiest probable piece of data that we can get to be able to create a property tax bill. Whereas our land systems are so fragmented, our land records are so, inexistent, and our land tenure systems are so overlapping that we wouldn't know, we couldn't start with taxing land. And so I think there is something to also be said, and I kind of, it kind of links to the discussion on the records and the valuation as well, is that your property tax system, however fancy, is only going to be as good as you can actually implement it. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And so a lot of the time where we see outdated valuations in many of the cities that I work in, it's because the valuation is really complicated and really expensive to do. And so you don't do it, right? And then it becomes outdated, and then your property tax system is not as efficient as it could be. And so I think when we think about what to tax, so I think my very first point is, in terms of structures, all structures, in my opinion, should be taxed because all of them pull on services and infrastructure. And if one structure is not paying, someone else is paying to make up for that structure not paying. However, how they pay and what the system that you put in place should be a system that you can actually implement and enforce and be able to collect the tax on. And that can be amended and built on over time. But I think that's just, a couple of reflections on that.
So, Asim, do you think moving towards sort of land value taxation is something that government should be thinking about, or do you think that with the current ARV system, there are other kind of interventions that can be done which would give higher dividend?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tricky. I mean, Anjum Naseem has a really nice comment over here. And I think it's worth bringing that principle. So for me, the issue is more two kind of criteria. One is operationally what's feasible, and that's what Astrid's point was right now. Capacity-wise, what data do we have which we can reliably get? And the second is, I think, the point Anjum raises, which is from an economic efficiency point of view, what is going to cause the least amount of distortion in an economy? And I think the principle of intermediate goods can be more distortionary. I think those are tough questions, but the right ones to ask. I should say one thing in this regard, which is, I don't think we're anywhere near the optimal non-distortionary tax system, but we definitely have weird perversities in our current system. So, for instance, the differential, there's massive differential, like between owner and self-occupied, between rented and owner-occupied. There's a massive difference in tax rates. So when you create things like that, especially on margins which are hard for you to actually verify, you're going to get very distortionary behavior. So my only kind of first request at this point would be to say, look, when there are massive rate differentials, realize it's going to create a massive distortion. So first try and either eliminate them, or if you think you can really justify them from an economics perspective, and from a enforcement capacity perspective, then you can keep them. Most of the ones I see, I don't think are justifiable in that sense. And so I think, but I'm not going to advocate, to be honest, for a massive change. I don't think that's where the first order issue is. I think the first order issue is some of the other questions we can have.
Ali, if I might come in just for a second. This differential between owner-occupied and rental property, when I worked on this issue with the former Chief Minister of Punjab, the difference was 1 to 10. It was an open invitation for tax inspectors to come in and suggest the bribe that will be needed for a fair distribution between three parties: the government, the tax inspector, and the owner of the house. So I think the Chief Minister bought to the need of reforming that, and the differential has been coming down since then. I don't know where it is reached now, but it's still, in most places it's 1 to 2. 1 to 10 is just absurd. And I think, Ghazan, that would be one place to start with an immediate impact on corruption levels and on the revenue impact in KP. But there's another question which has come up. I think Shah Rukh has asked this question of the burden of property tax across different income groups, which is linked up with the question of if it becomes a truly local tax tied up with local services, then what are you going to do across income groups and richer and poorer localities? Now, in Peshawar, of course, you will have rich localities and poor localities, and we know that the tax rates are different, just as in Lahore. So maybe within Peshawar, you can redistribute. But what do you do in DI Khan, where the rich base is going to be very, very small? And that's where you will have to have some kind of, cross jurisdiction distribution issues coming up. And that's something that it'd be good for the panelists to say how this is being addressed in other places.
Mustafa, I just want to come to you. There seems to be a consensus that moving away from the ARV system is going to be administratively challenging, and right now we should stick to it. But there are two things. The ARV system itself is a pretty involved system, right? I mean, with these large provincial surveys happening every 4 years for the adjustment of values, it's a system that actually hardwires the tax rate into the law. And it is a system which has this massively complicated valuation, although in Punjab they've somewhat simplified it, but it's still pretty complex. And I remember reading chapters from your thesis, which really talked about these kind of complexities in the valuation apparatus as being one part of the gaming that tax collectors can actually do while implementing that system. So do you think that the current system is pretty functional, or is it riddled with all sorts of costs that it's worth thinking about reforming?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and sorry, I lost the link somewhere back there. So I didn't get all the conversation, but to what you are saying, I think my sort of personal view on this, and the Punjab system has moved slightly to more advanced level since Asim and myself separately were working on the Punjab property tax. There has been a GIS assisted survey, at least in 5 or 6 major bigger cities. The rest have been digitized. The record has been digitized. They also have an automatic calculator of tax to sort of add transparency. So you can actually, I'm told, log on to something and give your property particulars, and it'll give you. So that what that does is 2 things. You see, where collusion comes in, and I don't know if this is the part we're supposed to talk about it, but the more, the less interaction the tax collector has from the taxpayer in any tax, really, sort of diminishes the chances of collusion, obviously. But here, it not only increases transparency, but it sort of helps people understand perhaps how this is worked out in a way. To what you're saying is, for my personal view, is that whether it's capital or rental based, I think the frequency in Punjab, the bigger issue that we're having, maybe KP is the same, is that valuations have been far in between. The stipulated 4 or 5 year valuation has not happened in Punjab. In the 2000s, it had not happened almost for 15 years before the one that happened finally in 2014 or something when it kicked in. It had not happened since 1999. So, that's why you see the graph of property tax to GDP really going down in the Punjab. I think the frequency rather than capital or rental, I mean, rental, at the end of the day, you see this tax is about the municipal services the property is using. Yeah, I see that there was a question about whether commercial should be taxed or not. Yes, commercial should be taxed if it is using the amount of municipal services it is using in the area. Everybody should be contributing to that. If you keep that simple principle in mind, I think there'll be a lot of clarity in what we have to do for property tax. Now, put it another way, local property tax is between 5 to 10% of, at least in 2000s, it was of most of the urban TMAs in Punjab, just 5 to 10%. The rest, majority, they were getting from transfers from the province, PFC, from transfer taxes, and some other own resources. Now, for that small amount, if you look at the other way around, property taxes really need to be figured out at a town hall level by the gap they have in any services that they're supposed to provide. If you look at it that way, that would perhaps simplify ways of collecting small or large amounts of money, whatever is needed. Because that is one of the reasons that it is so small that they are not worried about it. So like in the case of UK, tax rates, they call it council rates or something, are revised according to the transfer that you're going to get from the center. So that changes the way you think about property. So you don't go out and collect property tax for the sake of property taxes, but you go and collect it to fill the gap that you have to provide a certain level of services that you want to for your citizens. If you frame that question that way, then you work backwards on how much and how to collect property tax. Thanks.
Ali, could I just make a quick
Sure,
point on
absolutely.
the valuation?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just it just made me reflect on how long between the valuations. So in Mustafa's, who's saying like in some cases 15 years between valuation. And that's why I think another reason why trying to focus on increasing the frequency of valuations is important, because in a rapidly urbanizing place in 15 years, your property tax is going to go up a lot in a valuation cycle, and that's going to create even more political resistance. So if you are able to do the valuation more frequently, the increments in which your property tax goes up may be politically much more amenable. And so that's another reason I think that focusing on trying to do valuations regularly is important for local governments.
Yeah, so Richard, I mean, although Mujtaba has just said that valuations are pretty frequent in the UK, but actually from my recollection, they're pretty tardy themselves. I think there hasn't been a revaluation since 93 or 94. Do you, as an international development person, see this question of valuations as pretty central to the reform of property?
Yeah, so I think you're right in the sense, and I think maybe this was for a bit of clarity. I think he wasn't referring to the valuations as changing frequently. I think he was referring to the central government funding to local governments changing quite frequently, and then changing the overall level. So the valuations stay the same, but the rates vary year to year. But yeah, no, I mean, you've got to find a manageable level. I think Astrid's point about where you have this very rapid urbanization and rises happening, you would expect to see much more frequent rises in property value, and it may be worth the local governments doing more frequent valuations. But you've got to keep it sensible, and you've got to keep it as simple as possible, really. So yeah, keep it manageable. But if in the areas where there is a lot of change in the urban centres, then yeah, you may need to do it more frequently.
So Ghazan, I mean, what's the kind of KP government's position in terms of the reform? Is there kind of thinking about looking at what types of properties to tax and what type of valuation systems to use? Or is this discussion not something that's on the table for the provincial government at the moment?
In fact, in KP, I would say that fortunately or unfortunately, because of our lack of innovation in how this tax is collected, some of these distortions that you get with the rental system and all, we just haven't faced those. So just to give some background, and even with the land thing, like whether land is taxed or not, or you just tax constructed area, some of those issues, because of our lack of innovation in the system, is still there, and but at great expense to the amount that then is collected, right? For example, all our domestic taxes are collected, like domestic property taxes, are collected on the size of the plot. It doesn't matter what the constructed area on that is, and so essentially you are taxing land. It's just that the amount is very small because it's not linked to rental value or capital value or anything like that, and so that's it. And then most of our, even on our commercial side, in businesses, except for very few like big chains or those kind of, or like hotels and all, big hotels and all, that's on rental value. Otherwise, it's on measurement. And so again, that issue you don't see there. Unfortunately, without doing proper analysis, they tried changing that last year. And like Dr. Nabi said, suddenly people's taxes jumped up 10%, like they jumped up tenfold, because that's unfortunately the difference between people who are in properties running their own businesses as opposed to those who are in rental, their property tax is linked to rental values. And so we had to abandon collecting any taxes, which is why the previous year you see that fall. And so we've gone back this year to the measurement system, but we've increased the factor that's charged. So that kind of takes care of it a bit. And so this time when we do it, we want to do it properly. So the appetite is definitely there, which is why all of our projects that we're doing either through donors or even in our own ADPs is essentially we're having GIS maps, and we're asking them while doing that, trying to do pilots on both rental value and capital value, and what would be the best way to move forward, and then move that way. Because we've done it without a proper analysis before, and we had to take a step back. So we can't afford to get it wrong again. And so we are definitely interested, and we realize that that is the direction we need to move in. How to best do that is probably something that some of the great researchers that are on the panel hopefully can help us with.
Ali, if I might respond to something that Ghazan said. Ghazan, in Punjab, the reduction in the differential between owner-occupied and rental was combined with a reduction in the rates. So exactly to address the issue that you raised, that the sudden jump in the tax paid by owner of properties would be enormous. So it was combined with adjustment in the rate. And on the earlier point of Mujtaba, in 11-12, we really came very close to a very sensible property tax reform in Punjab on the policy side. And just then, the Punjab received a massive increase in its share because of the new NFC award. And as soon as the cabinet heard of that increase in the share coming from the center, all talk of property tax reform just disappeared, was off the table. So yes, they look at what the differential is in terms of what comes from the center, and that then determines the political willingness to go ahead with the property tax reform.
Yeah, but Dr. Nabi, I think, and that's where when they did it in KP, that's why they got it wrong. They didn't do the analysis. They just looked at what happened in Punjab. And so they reduced it from 20 to 10 to something like 18%. So those that were already paying on a rental value, they got a tax break. Those that weren't, they didn't realize that 18% still meant that it was, if not a 12-fold, it was still a 10-fold.
Yeah.
So that analysis before doing those changes is extremely important, which unfortunately we don't have the capacity at this point within the department, which is why we're trying to engage outside help.
Which is what you will fix.
So basically, so there are three interesting questions on this, and then I'd like to move on. Let me throw those up to do with valuations. One is the whole question about fairness. One of the questionnaires are basically saying that whatever valuation system that you use, concerns of fairness should be pretty central. But related to that is that if you're making the system fairer in terms of the capital value of land, then you might run into this problem of basically income poor, wealth-rich households. So what can be done about those? And thirdly, in terms of making the system fairer, the political resistance costs go up because the wealthier are powerful people. So the potential to implement kind of fairer reforms might be difficult. So let me open up thoughts on this issue of fairness, if people have, and then I'm going to come to my last question about administrative hurdles.
Maybe I can just give some quick initial thoughts and
Absolutely.
not answer the difficult bits, and everyone else can answer the difficult bits. But I think one of the things that is important to reflect on is the system that Ghazan was just mentioning, that is based on just area. that is probably equitably one of the least fair systems, because it's taxing everyone just based on an area plot. And so if you're a poor household and have X square meters, you're going to pay the same as a rich household with X square meters of that plot, even though that rich household may have a massive mansion on there and a lot more income to pay, right? And so I think so an area-based system is on a valuation is an easiest based system to implement, and we see that in a lot of cities, and as a sort of initial measure. But I think, you know, in this equitable area, it makes it more difficult. I think my other reflection is, you know, the obvious answer that is obviously given to this question is exemptions, but I want to caution on exemptions. I think particularly in my city, it is a massive loss of revenue to the city, because two things happen when you do exemptions. One, it becomes much more administratively difficult to run the system, because you've got to figure out who is eligible for the exemption, and so that costs you money, and then you lose money through the exemption. And then the second thing is it opens it up to abuse, right? Because particularly where you don't have the capacity to assess everyone as to their, you know, to be able to get the exemption, then that's a question. And then the question on top of that becomes, is the revenue loss justified? Because then across the city, the government, the local government has less revenue to implement services and infrastructure overall. And so I think that has to be weighed up as well as part of the sort of cost benefit calculation. So I just wanted to put out those two thoughts with relation to that question.
So Asim, I remember having discussions about exemptions with you. What's your view on sort of retaining exemptions as a way of addressing this question of fairness?
No, I agree with Astrid. I also think at least in the data we saw, they were really hard to apply and opened up corruption and uncertainty. I don't think that's the way to address equality. I think, look, this is a tough question. This is a question with all taxes, right? Property taxes in particular, you want to incentivize tax payments, which means people who pay should get what they pay for. But you want to be progressive in the sense that you want the rich to pay for the poor. I think that's just always true in all taxations. I think property tax will have to have, corner solutions should just be avoided. You'll have to have both. You have to have some component you get privately and you see, and in a localized public good sense. But you should also have people, look, we're a very charitable people. I mean, Adil Najam has some great work in the past documenting the amount of charity you paid. So you should also, when we talk about this is what your money paid for, it shouldn't just be in your area. It should also be this is what your money paid for in other areas, like you're helping develop your nation. And I do think, you know, sure, we're skeptical and say, you know, and cynical and say people don't value that, but I think people do. I think if done in a legitimate way where you can see it, people do. We take one blow for, you go to Data Saab in Lahore, you'll see what I mean, right? And so I think there is a sense in which we could play both, but you have to play both. You can't rely on one or the other. And I think that will bring in some element of progressivity in it. Ali Abbas has a bunch of really good questions around this as well, about, you know, these issues and so on.
On exemptions, Ali, when the exercise was done in Punjab, when I was involved with it, they announced exemptions for widows, I think sometime in the 80s. And suddenly the number of widows in Punjab jumped up hugely because all kinds of people wanted to register as widows. Now, whether it was an opportunity for the real number to come out or not is a separate matter, but it just seemed extremely odd. Similarly, exemptions on 10 marla plots, it's given across the board, regardless of whether it is in the poorest part of Lahore or in Liberty Market. Liberty Market, giving exemption to a 10 marla plot means giving exemption to a very rich man. So we need to look at exemptions very carefully.
Okay, so my last set of questions is about tax administration. Basically, I guess the big elephant in the room is the fact that, you know, with a lot of experimentation, revenues have remained particularly flat around property taxation all over Pakistan. As Ijaz said in his initial comments, basically, you know, if you look at cross country, Pakistan does really badly in the collection of these taxes. And one kind of big issue that's usually raised is this question of collusion between taxpayers and tax collectors, the whole issue of corruption, which goes down to the question of administration. And what kind of reforms you bring in over there to make the process simpler for taxpayers. So there's the issue of transparency and simplification, but then also the issue of increasing revenues by ensuring that the collusion and the corruption costs go down. So again, let me turn to Asim. Asim, you did sort of a lot of initial experimental work in Punjab around this. What are the learnings from that?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. So this is joint work with Adnan Kader at LSE and Ben Olkin at MIT, and now Ashim Avishok at the World Bank as well. I think, I don't want to summarize the details of the project, but let me just, we're running out of time fast. The essence of that result was by incentivizing tax collectors, both through financial means, performance-based systems, but also by introducing merit-based transfers and postings, both had pretty large effects on raising property tax, on the order of 60 to 70 to 80% increases. And also, not just that, but these increases were lasting. So the way, we have to realize, at least in Punjab, the way it was is, you're not raising taxes by having higher recovery rates. Actually, recovery rates are pretty good on paper, right? You suppress tax base. That's where the action is. And we've alluded to already in these things. And so the main action came from raising the tax base without any change in tax rates. It's just you reassess a property the way it should have been, the rental versus versus owner occupied. The advantage of this kind of stuff is it has long-term ratchet effects. Once you do it once, for the next 2-3 years, you can't undo that status. You certainly can't say, you could, but it's more, it raises more red flags when you do that. And so a one-time reform which can incentivize, and so we were really advocating for saying, look, any other reform you do, revalue properties, do a new survey, digitize the data. A lot of people have mentioned some great ideas which are happening and which Tobias alluded to, they're happening. You want to also, the human personnel response is complementary to them, not a substitute. Realize that. In fact, it's a necessary, I would say it's a very strong complement, because eventually the implementation of that technology will be done through the human. And there is a big literature on taxation, by the way, which is arguing, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Henrik Clevin at Princeton has a great set of papers, and Mazhar Azim has done some work in Pakistan along those lines, which is the idea of third-party data, or once you get better data systems or digitization, a lot of these problems of collusion, of corruption will go away. We'll have, instead of doing surveys of properties, every time someone files a plan with LDA, that automatically gets sent to the tax department, so you know what the construction will look like. So I'm fully supportive of that view, but I want to have one big caution. Like economics, we're very good at saying, here's equilibrium 1 and here's equilibrium 2, and equilibrium 2 looks a lot better. We have very few ways of figuring out how to move to equilibrium 2. And my one word of caution would be from a totally different field, from finance, which is mobile money was very successful in lots of places. Mobile wallets were not. And what's the difference between mobile money and mobile wallets? Well, both use technology, underlying technology. The difference was in mobile money, you had a human interface. You could go to the local shopkeeper and say, why did my transfer not go through? And have that element of trust. I don't think we will ever trust, either now or in future, even though I'm a technophile and I love technology, I don't think we'll ever trust machines. I don't think we'll ever trust anonymous third-party systems. So my view of kind of how we move in that transition is going to be not that you eliminate the tax collector. I don't think we're quite there where the US or UK would be, where I just get a tax form, I don't ever get to see who my tax collector is. I actually think we'll have to have a change in role over time, where our systems, our third-party systems allow the assessment act to be done through data. But the collection act, I think will still require a human, because in that collection process, we have to rebuild trust. So I'm a big believer, Astrid, so I'm slightly going to disagree on, I'm worried what the government is doing when you separate the collection from the receipt. Because I think that narrative is going to be very important to have between the citizen and the tax collector to say, because the person is going to say, what happened? Why should I pay you? And this is constantly what our tax collectors told us. They would not go to certain areas, I think that conversation is going to be really important. For that, you will need at least initially, a in-person dialogue around that. And so eventually maybe you could taper that off. And if that's true, then you need to make sure that person is fully incentivized. And that's where this set of papers we have about performance pay and merit-based transfers come in. So let me stop.
So Bushra, as both as Commissioner Lahore and then, you know, in your stint of working with the Property Tax Department, what's the potential you see of digitization? And what are the kind of complementarities between HR reform and digitization that Asim talked about? I mean, what should a reforming government keep in mind?
So, yes, thank you. I think there's great potential, and I think the fruits of the investment of the Punjab government in this, and I've always argued that Punjab government has been very slow at investing because it's not, property tax revenue is not their revenue. So they don't really see the money coming back to them. But it seems that when incentives to, as Asim pointed out, work, and when there are well-defined, well-tracked KPIs and not across the board as the FVR instance has been, but on actual performance, they can work very well and should be an ongoing sort of incentive structure within any tax department, but very well with all the caveats in place. However, I think that based on historical data, and I don't know if I can share a screen here, but I can put it up if you want, the property tax in Punjab, the revenues, just the nominal revenues have gone up substantially since the revaluation. There was a bump when Asim for a couple of years with his colleagues was doing his experiment, which gives you a very good sort of attribution effect because the revaluation had not been done. But after the revaluation, it's just gone quite steep, the graph. So in a way, the binding constraint really has been revaluation. And my sort of ethnographic, if your observation sort of work, tax collectors in working in excise department have not gotten terribly rich, even if there's been a lot of collusion on this. They really live on the margin. It's not a huge tax. And linking that up also to the impact on, when you're talking about exemptions, targeted exemptions, and I have the data here, you had about 30% of Punjab's property tax collection is being lost in exemptions. Now, out of that 30%, the 5-Marla exemption that Dr. Ijaz Nabi talked about knocks off out of 3.5 billion, about 2 billion plus goes off in the 5-Marla untargeted exemption. The widows and retirees and all the others traditional exemptions you've had are a very small amount compared to that. So you can carry on remissions, exemptions of that kind. But again, an untargeted subsidy, an untargeted tax expenditure like this would also be more hurtful than anything. Thank you.
So Astrid, I mean, these are kind of complementary points that Asim and Mushtaba actually raised. So in some sense, what we're learning from the Punjab experiment is that the big incentive is to repress the base. And one way to deal with the increasing the base is to revalue. But there's a human element in revaluation too, because there are people who go, they assess properties, they mark prices and so on. So is there kind of global learning on using incentives around this whole issue of the valuation of the base? And are those interventions something that KP government could think about?
Yeah, so I think we have, and here I also want to just give a shout out to my colleagues who've done some great case studies, and we will be publishing those soon about different property tax regimes in different cities. And I think one of the things that I will say about the human element of it is that it provides jobs as well, right? And that's partially also why sometimes changing the system is very difficult. And where we've seen system change move to a more technology-based system, as Asim said, where data is sort of trying to drive the valuation as opposed to people driving the valuation. We've also seen those a number of cases where that reform has failed because of a big lobby of those people who do the valuations. And that's a sort of very specific job piece. I would also say that there is now a sort of a growing literature about the use of technology. And I think, Mustafa, you mentioned it in a previous comment about delinking the sort of tax collector and the taxpayer a little bit. And I think that's actually important in terms of reducing corruption. And that happened in my city, right? And so we moved to a much more digital payment system of property tax. And two things that does is it allows the taxpayer to pay digitally via mobile money, usually here in my case. But also the other thing that it does, it allows the city to know what it should be collecting. And I think prior to that system, the reason sort of why collusion was much more easier is because no one had a record of what actually should be paid and what actually came in. And so just even understanding what is supposed to be paid and what is coming in and where the differences in that can help sort of improve the system. But I think overall, I think in understanding where the opportunities lie here, I think I just can fully sort of echo what Asim said. It's also about understanding the incentives of people, because wherever as much technology is used in the system, there's always people involved. And it's about understanding, and I think there was a question in the Q&A about sort of behavioral sort of economics and the role it has to play there. And I think there is an important piece about that as well.
Ali, you're muted.
A lot of international development sort of thinking has been about digitization and has sort of underemphasized this role of incentives in terms of improving civil services in general, but also tax collection. So what's the current thinking? And is it open enough to think about incentives and reform of these?
Ali, I assume that's Richard you were asking? We missed
Yeah, I was asking that of Richard. Yeah, sorry, Richard. My computer's playing up a bit. The screen is hanging now.
Sorry, Ali, I missed the first part of your question, but I think you were asking about the incentives for digitalization in reforms.
A lot of international development people tend to focus on digitization as a solution, but what's coming out of this conversation is there's a complementarity. So we also have to think about incentive reforms in HR. So what's the current thinking in the kind of international development circuit?
I think that's a really good question. I think the thing with digitalization is it can be very helpful. It can assist things a lot, but it doesn't take away the necessity to get to the back end where all these policies are formulated and solve those tough issues like how do you do evaluation, or the administrative reforms that have to take place. So it can be helpful, and it's definitely something that we shouldn't be dismissive on in terms of its role to assist with these things. But it's not going to be a magic bullet in terms of solving these difficult questions which the panel have been grappling with today. So yeah, I mean that the more we can support digitalization in Pakistan, I think the better, because I think Pakistan is well placed to benefit from that. But yeah, I mean, there's some tough issues, right, on the property tax side, and they're not going to go away through digitalization.
Thanks, Richard. So, Ghazan, I think we've had a really rich discussion. So, the last question I'm going to pose to you: that what are the important threads that you've been able to draw from this for your reform process? So, your thoughts on that would be kind of really nice to get.
Yeah, I think the discussion that we've had, there are a lot of the things over here that were discussed, some of the things that we're thinking about here as well. The only concern as I was listening to everyone talking was that there's so much here because the starting point in KP, Punjab has still done quite a bit of reform as it is, and we're kind of looking at them to kind of what's worked there to try to then implement that here. But our starting base is so low over here that I think the fear now that I have is to be trying to do too much at the same time. Like we're doing digitization as well. We're looking at from Dr. Asim's work in Punjab to try to look at using both financial incentives as well as posting transfers as well. But then what actually works, what doesn't? The fear actually then becomes that you try and do so many things at the same time that you don't know what's working and what's offsetting the other. So I think the important part from this conversation that I kind of pick up from the KP perspective is that kind of making that roadmap of what needs to happen first, and then kind of moving towards analyzing what the impact of each change is, and then building up on that. So that would be, I think, my biggest takeaway from here. And to kind of, in the KP sense, what we're looking at, while some of these things might take some time, especially if you want to do your GIS maps, we want to do our entire automation system, that would take time. And then there are smaller things which we can do to kind of, that kind of tries to achieve the same things, like limiting the interaction between the tax collector and the taxpayer. Like, for example, one of the steps we're taking is to send out the challans through the postal service. And instead of a one-liner on your challan bill, have the entire calculation how it's done, so that easily it can then be challenged by the taxpayer. So there's simpler things that we're also looking at trying to do. But I think one thing for sure is that a lot of this work has been done. And so we're at a stage where there's a lot that we can learn from to do in KP. And I think even for researchers, it would be exciting to come to KP and help us through this, because we're at a starting point where, you know, it's like some of these things have been done, we've made mistakes somewhere, and we're at a point where we can learn from there and try and do it the right way over here.
Thanks, Ghazan. That's great. So I want to thank my panelists. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think we've had a rich discussion and covered a wide ambit, learning both from global and national experience. I think this is a really, really important reform because I think both sort of getting growth up in cities, but also making service delivery more equitable is going to be a big challenge going forward. Pakistan is, by some estimates, already a majority urban country, and that urbanization is going to grow. So this instrument is really an important instrument. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that, you know, there is a strong engagement with reform in KP. It'd be great to see some of these things come into implementation and design fairly quickly. And I hope this could be one of many conversations on this important issue to follow, not just on the taxation side, but urban property tax reform and urban institutional reform. Those would be important conversations to happen later. So thank you to Asim, Richard, Ghazan, Astrid, Mujtaba, Hassan, and Ijaz. And I really want to thank the CDPR team, Zara, Salman, Sharmeen, Hina, for really, really putting this together very efficiently. Thank you all. And the participants for great questions. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Great seeing you all. Bye.
Thank you very much.